Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's lesson, I'm going to teach you.
Okay, so we're going to run through the absolute basics of what you need to know to be able to create websites using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's get started. I have here a completely empty folder, and within this I want to put some kind of HTML file. But to get started, I'll just create a folder which I'll randomly name as website. Okay, I'll open up this folder, and in here now we want to put our HTML files and our supporting CSS and JavaScript files. Now, just open your favorite editor. In this case, I'll use Sublime Text 2, and I'll drag in the whole folder into Sublime so that I can get this tree where I can browse the files that I want to work with. So I'll just full screen Sublime. So the first thing I'll do is that I have this empty file now, and what I will do is I'll save this as index.html. And you'll notice that I now have this index.html file within the website folder. So the thing with an HTML file is that it's just another text file. It's just another file with the extension .html. So if you have a file which has the extension doc or docx, that's a file that Word understands. So it's a convoluted text file that only Word can open. Now, an HTML file is a file that contains HTML that any text editor can open because it's just text. But if you give a browser an HTML file, then it will render it as a web page. So let's get started in actually creating the file. The first thing we need to do is to supply a doc type. Now, in explaining doc types, we could make this quite convoluted, but I'll just sort of glance over this and saying that this is due to the history of, for example, the browser wars, where HTML has been around for quite some time and browsers have decided to implement different features of HTML, allow different types of things being done in HTML. Consequently, we've come to the point where we need to specify what kind of standard we're following when we're creating the HTML document. Again, glancing over this, if you just specify this, if you just say doc type HTML, then, or actually exclamation point doc type HTML, then what we're going to do is create a document that corresponds to the standard of HTML5. So before you find another reason to actually worry about this, just ignore it for now and use doc type HTML. So the first thing we'll do is that we'll just specify that this is a HTML document by creating the element HTML. So in HTML, we work with what is called elements. So this is an element and this is a tag. So this is the opening tag HTML and this is the closing tag HTML. Together they form the element of HTML. This is the root node of the tree in an HTML document. Now, what do I mean when I say tree? Well, HTML documents are trees. So we could say something like the root node of the document is HTML. Under the root node of HTML, or like the root of the tree, we could put a branch which is called head. And again, under the root node of HTML, we could put another branch which would be body. So head and body are now referred to as children of the root node HTML. Within head, we could put something like title, which would then be a child of head, which is a child of HTML. So title now is not nested within body, but body is only nested directly under HTML. So head and body are sort of on the same level of nesting, and these are siblings. And now under body, we could, for example, put h1, which is a header, and we could put a p tag, which is for a paragraph. So now p and h1 are siblings, and p is a child of body, and h1 is a child of its parent body, and body is the child of HTML. So this is how we build HTML documents, but this was just pseudocode. What we actually write is something like this. So this is the same thing again. I have HTML, and within the element HTML, I put the head element. As a sibling to the head element, I put the body element. So now we have two nodes. We have the root node, and then we have the head node, and we have the body node. And within this, I can put different stuff. So let me just put title here, my super fine website, and close up title. So you can see now that I'm doing this in two ways. On line 3, I'm opening head and closing it on line 5. However, on line 4 here, I'm opening title and writing the contents of the title on the same line and then closing on the same line. Now, these are both valid. Stop and think about this for a minute and consider why this is not valid. Note how I'm using indentation to show what is nested within what. Here we're opening head, here we're closing head. Here we're opening title, and here we're closing title. This is very hard to indent because it's incorrectly formatted. because we're opening something, we're opening a child which is titled within head, but we're closing it outside of head, which doesn't make any sense. So I need to close title in here. Again, this could be written like so. Doesn't really matter. But for the sake of brevity, I'll just put it like this. So what we have now is the absolute minimum that you would need to create an HTML document. Under the standard of HTML5, if you try to do anything less than this, you won't actually conform with the standard. So if we save this now, I'll go back to the folder, and you can see that my index.html file has this little website symbol. So if I double click it, I'll open it in a browser, and you can see here at the top that the title that I put in was my superfine website, and it shows up here in the tab. However, apart from this title, you can see that we have nothing but an empty page. So let's now actually put something into some content into this page. So we talked about the h1 element before, or the h1 tag. So let's put something like this is my awesome title. Too much is awesome today. So let's actually put this in as well. There's the p element, or the paragraph tag. This is a paragraph containing. Okay, so having a look at this, so what you can see now is that we get this title, which by default has a larger font than this paragraph. So we now have two tags. We have the h1 tag, and we have the paragraph tag. Let's just quickly look at what happens if we input another paragraph. This is... So we have two p tags. We'll look at this again, and you can see that the first paragraph is on one line and the second paragraph is on another line. So you can think of this as something like a paragraph in your regular text editor, whether you're using Word or OpenOffice or Pages. So whenever you hit enter, this is like creating another paragraph tag. A lot of people are taught to do something like this. This is another paragraph of text, and this is another line of text. Let's have a look at this. Here we are in the same paragraph, but we are breaking the text of this paragraph. So we are breaking onto another line because we have a paragraph tag and the paragraph and the ending paragraph tag here. So the paragraph sort of encapsulates these two lines, where in these two lines we have this BR tag, right, which stands for break. So paragraph and break. So what this break tag would correspond to in a text editor is something like pressing Shift-Enter in a lot of the text editors, which means that you're sort of creating a fake paragraph. You're breaking onto a new line, but you're still in the same paragraph. So generally, if you're just working with text, ignore this idea of BRs, unless that's actually what you want to do, and then just end the paragraph and create a new one. So now we have 3 lines of text. The use of the BR tag opens up an interesting question, where the BR tag was just one tag, was just like an opening tag without a closing tag. That gives us the understanding that there are elements that are built up of opening tags and closing tags. And then there are self-closing tags such as BR or HR, which stands for horizontal rulers. So saving this and having a look, horizontal ruler just pulls a line from the left to the right, just across the page, right? And if you think about this, a horizontal ruler, it doesn't really make any sense to have an opening and a closing for a horizontal ruler, because a line is always a line. You cannot really put anything into a line. Another tag which behaves this way is the image tag. So I'll just grab an image from the awesome service which is called PlaceKitten. So if I do this, I input the tag img and then give it the source of this URL, then we get this awesome cat image, right? And if you think about this again, it doesn't really make any sense to do something like this, to close the image, because what would I put here? Right? The image is the image. What would I put here? So putting something inside an image is not a concern of HTML, it's a concern of like an image editing program. So image is also one of these tags that are self-closing. This, however, also brings up an interesting question. What's up with this src equals blah, 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 blah? This is the idea of attributes. All of this is an attribute for the img tag. So what we're saying is that if we delete this for a moment and think about it, we have an img tag, right? We say there is an image at this location in the page. But if we just say this, it doesn't really make any sense. The browser goes, okay, there's an image, but where's the image? How can I find the image? So we need to specify the src, the source of the actual file. So we're saying I have the img tag, there I have an image, and this is where you can find the image. So this is known as the property, and this is known as the value. So we specify, this is general form, we specify some kind of property for the tag and say that this property equals some kind of value. And generally we put this in quotation marks so that the HTML parser is not confused about what part belongs to the value. Okay, but what if I wanted to put like a border around this image? Now, in the old days, what people would do is that they would add another attribute, another property to the img tag and say something like border equals 5. We can try this out, and we can see that we actually get a border. However, we've sort of come to the point now where we realize that adding a border is actually a visual concern. And this brings us into the point where we need to discuss what is the concern of HTML and what is the concern of CSS. So, the things we're talking about today is HTML, and we're talking about CSS, and we're talking about JavaScript. So, HTML is the markup language, right? HTML defines the tree of the document. What are the contents of this document? HTML can be seen as sort of the entry point of this website. CSS is the style of the website, meaning what does it look like, right? What colors are there? Where are things positioned? Etc., etc. And JavaScript can be seen as the interactivity to some extent. I mean, you can achieve some interactivity just using HTML, but the things that people do with JavaScript today are just absolutely crazy. So you can see JavaScript as any more kind of complex interactivity that you do with the website without having to reload the page. So how are these then connected? Well, again, the HTML can be seen as sort of the entry point of the website. So what happens is that the browser loads the HTML file, and the HTML file will point to a CSS file and point to a JavaScript file, and then pull the contents of these files in and load them into the browser so that we can execute whatever styles are in the CSS file and whatever code is in the JavaScript file. So let's look at how we do this more concretely. I'll just go into head and add the link tag, and I'll just say link rel style sheet href for like hyperreference, and then I'll just assume I have a folder which is called style sheets, and then I'll just say /main.css. So I'm assuming I have this file, which if you look at the source tree here, I obviously don't. So saving this file, going into the browser and reloading, I've removed the border before, but now nothing happens because we don't actually have that CSS file. What we could do to make this a bit interesting, now I'm in Chrome here, but generally now all of the browsers have some kind of developer tools. Probably this originated from Firebug, but I may be wrong on that. So I'll just right click and say inspect element to bring up the developer tools. And then if I go to the network tab here, and then reload the page, what you can see is that the network tab now captures all of the requests that this page does. So what happens first is that we get the index.html file, and then we hit the point where we wanted to get the main.css file. But you can see this is red, and you can see that the status of this is failed, because obviously we didn't find the file because the file didn't exist. And then just out of curiosity, we can see that we also get this placekitten image file, which is the cat image up here. So obviously now we need to actually add the CSS file. So I assumed it was in a style sheets directory and the file name was main.css. So I'll just right click here and go new folder and create a folder called style sheets, and right click on this folder and go new file, and I'll just directly save this as main.css. So expanding this tree, you can now see that we have main.css within the folder style sheets, which is within the folder website, which is where index.html resides. So reloading this page now, having a look at the network tab, we can now see that we get a success for main.css. So we're actually loading in the file, but nothing happens because there is no content within this main.css file. So let's just do something very basic here so that we can understand what CSS does. So I'll just type in body and I'll say background : red. Let's refresh. Super red. Okay, so let's briefly talk about CSS. So what CSS does is that you define a selector, right? We pick body, which will look for something in your HTML file. So if we say body here, what we'll hit is that we'll hit this body here. We'll hit this body tag here. If I would have typed H1, we would have hit this H1. If I would have typed P for paragraph, we would have hit this P, and this P. So it's general for all of them. But now I'm just saying body and we'll hit body. Then we have the same idea of having keys and values. We have a property and we have a value. So we're saying that we want the background property to be red. This is shorthand for saying background color red. So of course I could say blue. That would get blue. So actually you would define these as something like, this is how you regularly define colors using hex values. Or you could actually define colors using the RGB function, so like 25, 25, 25 being another color. Or you could do that giving it specifying RGBA, which is RGB plus alpha. So it's like saying red 25, green 25, blue 25, and then an alpha of 0.5, which would be half transparent. So then we get the same color but semi-transparent. Anyways, so when we say red, it's just that some of these colors are predefined into words. So then we can change the value, but we could also change the key. So we could, instead of saying background, we could actually say color. Now what that does is that instead of changing the background color, it changes the text color. So now all the text within the page is red. This brings us into the interesting point of cascading within styles. So we said that the color of body is red. However, body is here, and since P is a child of body, and H1 is a child of body, and this P is a child of body, then the rule saying that the color should be red cascades down from body into H1 and into P, etc. Now this goes for some of the styles, but not all of them. So now we know how to connect CSS, but then let's just do one more final thing before we wrap this up. We also want to connect the JavaScript. So we do the same thing as here. We do the same thing as with the style sheet. We make a connection within the head block saying that we want to load a JavaScript file. Actually, let me make a quick brief pause there and just talk about why we put this into the head block. So please recall what I said before about the minimal tree of a standards conforming HTML5 document is that we need to have HTML, we need to have head, and the head needs to define a title, and then we need to have body. This is the minimal document. And sorry, actually also we need doc type here. Now the interesting thing I want to talk about is why do we have head and why do we have body, and what do we define in head and what do we define in body? These are the two children of HTML, and we shouldn't define any other children directly under HTML. We should define stuff either under head or under body, right? So the thing is, under head we put like meta content, and under body we put all the actual content, right? So under head we put the content about the content, and under body we put the actual content. So if you consider yourself doing a blog post, right? The blog post resides under body. However, under the head, this is where we put the links to the style sheets and the JavaScript files and maybe even some meta tags defining what kind of tags would apply to this document. So sort of telling search engines what kind of content our page contains. Or we could define language, right? These are the kind of things that we would put into head. However, in body, we would just put all the content, all the stuff. So in some sense, as the rule of thumb, this is the stuff about the page, and this is the actual page. This is the visual content. Okay, so this is why we put the style sheet within the head block. So back to the JavaScript. What we do is that we would just define another tag, which is script, and we'll say src, and I'll assume again we have a folder which is JavaScripts, and I'll just say main.js, and then I need to close the script tag. So please do note here that the JavaScript file is main.js, right? .js because it's a JavaScript file. The style sheets file is main.css because it's a CSS file. And of course, this could be this could be whatever, and this could be something different. It's just that I chose these names because these are names I use sometimes. So now we're loading in main.js. Let's just quickly go into the browser and look at the networks tab again. And we can see now that we're trying to load in main.js, but it fails on line 6 of HTML, which is this line. So what we'll do is that we'll just create the JavaScripts folder, JavaScripts, And in this folder, I'll create a file which I'll save and call main.js. So now we actually have a file. We'll save that, reload again, and we can see that it now successfully loads. So let's now do something interesting in this. We could, for example, just do console log hello world from JavaScript. This is something that you wouldn't want to put into any kind of public website. But console log is something that we as developers can use to debug our pages to understand what's happening in our JavaScript. Going back to this page, moving to the console tab, and then just reloading the page, we can now see hello world from JavaScript. So if we close this developers tab, refresh again, this console log statement sort of seems to do nothing because it's just something that we use as developers. If we would use something that would be actually sensible for the user, hello and welcome to my about kittens. Huzzah! I'll close the developer tab, refresh the page, and we now get this JavaScript alert whenever the page is loaded, because as soon as the page loads, we load our JavaScript, and the JavaScript defines this alert call, and this is the text that we put into the alert call. So now we've successfully connected the JavaScript, and you have all the power of the JavaScript. I'll just comment out this line so that we won't be bothered by that annoying alert again. So the very last thing I want to show you that I just briefly mentioned was the fact that you can put scripts and you can put style sheets directly into the HTML document. Now, in 9 out of 10 cases, if not even more, you want to put your resources in separate files. So doing what we're doing here is a good idea. Generally, it's a good idea. But for you to have a deeper understanding of this, I do want to show you that if we do add a separate script tag here, open it up and then close it down, everything between these two are actually considered to be JavaScript. So we could say alert and then hello from inline JavaScript, if I could type correctly, and then run this. We do get hello from inline JavaScript. So we're running JavaScript directly from the HTML document, which means that we could ignore loading this external file. So we'll just remove that, refresh again, and we're still getting this alert. But again, the point of doing this is that in any non-trivial website, you have more than one HTML file, which means that you would need to duplicate JavaScript between HTML files sometimes. So these are not truths, these are preferences. And if you're doing a one-pager, then yes, I mean, you could of course do this. But even if you're doing a one-pager, I assume it would be sensible to rock your JavaScript in a separate file. And then of course, now we did this for JavaScript, but you could also do this for CSS. So if we would put a style tag here, open up the style tag and close the style tag, then everything between this opening tag and this closing tag is considered to be CSS. So now if I would write a style for body and say something like background is blue, save this and reload, then the background color is now blue. And the same thing goes for here. If you have multiple HTML pages, you generally have some kind of styles that you'd want to reuse between pages. So doing this is not really a good idea. And you could even do it worse than this. What we could do is that we could add style as an attribute on an actual element. So now we have h1 here, for example, then we could add the style property and give it some kind of value. And the value here would be CSS. So then we could say color, for example, and say green. I'll save this, refresh. The blue color in the background disappeared because I've removed the style statement from the head. But you can see now that the title is now green, whereas these paragraphs are still red. So the color green style here applies directly on this h1. So this is known as inline styles. And again, I would highly advise against doing this unless you have a very specific understanding of why you are doing it. So I think that sort of wraps up all the stuff that I wanted to get covered in this screencast, and hopefully now you've gotten some kind of introduction and are ready to conquer the world of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Thank you very much.